All right, now my mic is unmuted, so hello everyone, and welcome to this webcast. We're going to talk about 8K today. So again, thank you for joining the webcast. My name is Chris Chinnock. I am the Executive Director of the 8K Association, as well as President of Insight Media. So this presentation today is going to it's based on a 49-page report that we put together, the 8K Association put together over the last couple of months, and it's basically based on a lot of input from subject matter experts throughout this whole 8K ecosystem. So I'm going to try and reflect what I've heard from these experts. So by no means am I a subject matter expert in all the topics that we'll be covering today. I'll try and answer some of your questions as best I can. And if I can't, I'll try and get experts who can answer those questions a little bit better. So basically, this webinar is going to summarize kind of the findings of this report. It's a fairly long report, because the ecosystem is pretty broad, so I'll try and move through this fairly quickly to keep on schedule here. At the end of the webinar, we are recording this, so the video of the webinar will be available. The slide deck will be available, as well as that full 49-page text-based report. As far as logistics go, there is a question box on your control panel. I hope you see that down there. I've built in a few breaks in the presentation, so if you have some questions, I'll try and answer those. Just put them in that question box. I'll try and answer them. I've also included 3 polls along the way, so we'll pause and do those just to keep you awake. Okay. So here's the outline. I'll do a little bit of introduction, and then we'll talk about the basic, the major components of the ecosystem: the content and creation and production section, distribution, playback, and display. Okay, so let's start with a little background on the 8K Association itself. We are a not-for-profit organization formed in January of 2019. Initially by TV makers and panel makers. We've now expanded that activity throughout the membership throughout the ecosystem. And our mission is really to help educate both consumers and professionals about 8K, and of course to encourage the expansion of that ecosystem as well. We also have a new consumer-facing website. And that's really aimed at not only education, but to help them make some buying decisions about 8K products, because we have a certification program, which is only for TVs at this time, but that's designed to help make that move forward. And to be clear, we don't want to be purists and say that everything has to be shot, produced, and distributed and displayed in 8K. And the standard kind of 16:9 format. Other uses of 8K we want to see encouraged as well. So that could be things in medical, it could be virtual reality, it could be digital signage. So it's all things 8K that we want to see going forward. And even if you just capture an 8K and still just finish and distribute in 2K or 4K, that's okay. That's part of the 8K ecosystem starting to move the ball forward. So here's a quick list of our members at this point. As you can see, it kind of spans the ecosystem. So we continue to try and expand that as well. Organizationally, pretty straightforward stuff: board directors, executive management, and then a number of work groups. And I won't go into all the details of what the work groups are doing. I've got a couple little highlights of activities in the slide deck, which I'll brief you on. Okay, so let's get to the very basics here. What is 8K? I think most of you understand this. It's a lot more pixels than 4K or HD. And I kind of like showing it in this format because it gives you the idea that 8K is that bigger palette, that bigger canvas that maintains that same pixel density as you scale up in this kind of image here. So here's actually a nice slide that Samsung Display put together based on data from IHS, that's what they were called at the time. And basically, this is data that supports the fact that that display resolution has basically a 7-year cycle, and this cycle is basically defined as the introduction date to reaching 50% of sales. So this is, I think, TV sales they were talking about here. So we've had a pretty consistent cycle of 7 years from all these resolution changes. So the message here, 8K is right on track here, right on schedule. So the trend here is clearly been to more pixels, but that's also that trend is happening throughout the ecosystem as well. That it's happening at different rates in different parts of the ecosystem. And as we'll see, it's the displays and the capture side that typically lead in these next transitions. But it's also want to be clear that the 8K trend here is not just about extra pixels. People think it's just more pixels. Well, it is more pixels, but these are HDR pixels. So let's not forget that it's better pixels as well as more pixels going forward here. And as most people will agree, I think this is well, 8K and higher resolution is the highest capture quality that you can get today, and the highest display level, at least in a TV scale display today. And if it's well captured, well mastered, distributed, and displayed, it is a very high contrast, 3D-like, looking through the window kind of image. And you know, many people have been awed in those images that we move from each a resolution revolution or evolution. And I think one of the key points we want to stress is that 8K capture adds the kind of flexibility to create content that the filmmakers want, that flexibility for the creation, but also it enables a much better lower resolution deliverables, and I'll go into that in just a second. So where are we in the kind of state of this lens, the living room right now? I think most of you know we have a number of 8K TVs that are on the market today, all from the major brands, all offer TVs today, and these represent the peak of their TV lines. We have all production equipment for both live and file-based workflows are here today. And that's evidenced by the fact that NHK has been broadcasting since December 2018, so coming up on 2 years of experience here. And they primed the pump by helping the manufacturers build all this equipment. So this is real, and it happens today. If you look on YouTube and Vimeo, you will see thousands of 8K clips. Granted, these are smaller, shorter clips and a lot of natures and other documentaries. We haven't seen a lot of feature films, or haven't seen any feature films, at least on YouTube and Vimeo. NHK has them, of course. So it's starting, but it's not prolific yet. Major sporting events have featured 8K cameras, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. There are some 8K subscription services available, fledgling ones, I'll grant you, but starting. And you may also be aware that the next generation gaming consoles will support 8K. Not clear if there'll be a lot of 8K games, but there will be support to move that forward as that ecosystem can evolve. So the bottom line here, I think, is there's a lot of parallels between where we are in the development of the 8K ecosystem and where we were 6-7 years ago when 4K was coming on board. There's a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same pushback, and I think we'll see a lot of those barriers that were around 6-7 years ago and have basically fallen for 4K at this point. I think we'll see those fall again. So let's move into the next section here. Okay, so some of the benefits here. 8K enables that wider field of view while maintaining that same pixel density. So if you think of this in the sports analogy, you can now get that whole sporting field with one camera instead of with high pixel density, which is the key here. And that allows you to do a number of different things, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But one of them, and this is a very important aspect here, is it enables you to do 4K or 2K reframing, or these kinds of region of interest tracking. So you can define an area within this 8K canvas and do cutouts. And these can be actually direct-to-air cutouts if you're talking about a broadcast situation, or you're just reframing if you're doing a movie or a dramatic television show. You can do pan and scan, so you can move that window around within this 4K canvas and not lose resolution. If you do that within a 2K or 4K capture, you're compromising resolution, of course. You can also create lower noise content, which is kind of an interesting development. And as I said before, you can create better 4K and 2K deliverables. This is the beauty of oversampling. I've also heard people say that if you have an 8K camera on some commercial applications, you can actually use the stills from those 8K video cameras for things like advertising and print for commercials. It's high enough resolution. Typically, you would have to have a digital still camera to get those higher resolution images if you're not using an 8K camera. So you get some benefit of using both of them. And I've also heard a lot of people talk about the benefits of higher resolution in your special effects workflow. You can have much cleaner edges around objects, which makes for better mats and plates, and it just makes their job easier, is what I've been told anyway. So the benefit, future-proofing, of course. If you're having any kind of archival value for the content that you're creating, why not capture it in the highest resolution possible today? It's just going to make it more marketable down the road. So here's just a couple examples here. An 8K image with a 4K crop, so you can pull that out without losing that resolution. You wouldn't have this advantage if that was a 4K image, of course. And here's the region of interest thing I was talking about. So in this case, you've got 4 windows that are each on one of the musicians here. And this software has become actually quite sophisticated, and you can actually now track these musicians, or if they're sports figures, track them across the field. And each of these can be direct-to-feed, direct-to-air windows that can be cut from one to the other. So now you're using one camera to do all this, where before you might have used 2, 3, or 4 cameras. So, clear benefit here, I think. And then here's an example of the resampling comparison here. So this is a 2K capture on the left, which has been up converted for a 4K deliverable, a native 4K capture and 4K deliverable, and then an 8K capture down res to 4K for a deliverable. And I'm not sure if you can see this well enough on your screen, but there's a clear trend toward sharper and crisper images in 8K, as you might expect. So here is our poll number 1, and let me see if I can get this onto the screen so you can vote. Okay, I think that I don't have a monitor to see what you're seeing, but I see some votes coming in, so good. I think you're able to do this right now. So I will also take this opportunity to check the question box if there are any questions in this. Let me try and expand this a little. Okay, this is about this question is about expanding. How is the 8K ecosystem expanding due to COVID-19 impacts of not being able to go to trade shows and kind of perhaps pushback at retail? Yeah, and the other point of this is that the Olympics, which were supposed to take place this last summer in Japan, were postponed, of course, because of the pandemic. So there has been an impact on the rollout of 8K. However, from what I've seen from the conversations, most of the, at least on the equipment side, most of those plans have gone forward. So products are still being developed, though still being rolled out. Conferences are taking place virtually, so there's not as much exposure to these new products and not as much discussion around 8K and other topics. But I have seen, there seems to be progress going on. I think some of the trials, which would have happened if without the pandemic, those have probably been delayed a bit. So yeah, I'd say there's probably a 6-month, maybe a year, up to a year delay, I think, in the rollout. It's probably a reasonable assessment. Okay, any more questions? I think there's one more here. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Hold on. Okay, at the SEMTI ATC several years ago, NHK showed a soccer match covered with 2 8K cameras from which they extracted up to 8K windows, each dynamically extracted. This might be the most profound impact of 8K imaging and could lead to smaller camera crews at sporting events. Absolutely correct, and which is the benefit I just described. Thank you, Pete. When you reference 8K, does it encompass both HEVC and ABC production? It does, and I'm just being rather agnostic calling it 8K at this point because I mean, it's going to be captured in a number of different camera codecs or RAW, and then it does go through production pipeline. It's only when it gets toward distribution, for the most part, that it gets encoded in HEV or ABC for distribution. But we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. Is there somewhere to download 8K footage for testing transcode systems? Well, you should be able to download it from YouTube. That's publicly available. It's going to be AV1 encoded most likely. So you'd have to transcode it back to something else to do some. Talk to me separately about that. Okay, let me go back to the poll and see. Let's close this out and see what we got here. Okay. Let me make this a little bit bigger so I can read it. Okay, so the question was, the benefits of 8K capture and production are not well understood by key decision makers. That's kind of what I think at this point. So I just basically wanted to see what you guys think. And the answer is 16% strongly agree with that statement, 48% somewhat agree with it, 21% are not sure, 13% somewhat disagree, and 2% strongly disagree. So thank you for that feedback. We will certainly keep that in mind. Thank you. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about cameras. If you are not following what's going on with 8K cameras, there's a lot of activity out there. It's actually quite a bit that are available. I broke them down into several categories here. So cinema grade cameras are available from Red, Panavision, Astrodesign, Sony, Zcam, Kinfinity. At least these are the ones I'm aware of. There's also a number of broadcast grade cameras. So these are typically 3 sensor, whereas the cinema grade are typically single sensor, larger single sensor imagers. So Sharp, Sony, Hitachi, Panasonic, Ikegami, all Japanese manufacturers, not surprisingly, because these were all supported by, I guess some of them were supported by NHK to get that ecosystem going. But we've also got some consumer grade cameras coming down the road here. You probably, some of you may have heard what's coming from Sharp and Canon, as well as Bosma and Skyworth. These are all going to be 8K 30 frame kinds of cameras, but they're all in the, I think all of them are going to be in the $4,000 to $5,000 price range. So that's not unreasonable at this point. And there are actually 8K cameras in smartphones today. There's a number of brands that are offering that. Again, 24 or 30 frame capture in those cameras. But you can see the ecosystem for cameras is here today. You can get it from cheap to expensive, anything you want. And think about that. Not only will professional grade content be available, but we'll be seeing, I think, a lot of user-generated content as well. So I think, this is a necessary part of the ecosystem. You need displays at one end, but you also need cameras at the other. And this is how the 4K market developed. I think this is exactly how it's shaping up on the 8K market now. And let's not forget, there are cameras now with more than 8K resolution. Blackmagic has announced this 12K camera. So that sensor is got 80 megapixels. That's a lot of pixels. But I believe this is a bare format, so the actual debayered image will be smaller than that, but should be about a quarter of that. But 14 stops, and look at the price, $10,000. So this is pretty impressive camera right here, and I've already talked to one content creator that's going to be using this on a production, and they're specifically using this camera to capture some of the background plates because they'll have a live theatrical version of their movie as well. So that's kind of interesting. And I just learned about this one. This is, well, he's calling an 18K camera. So the sensor itself is 260 megapixels. That's a lot of pixels, but it's in a 4:3 aspect ratio. So this is really designed for IMAX theaters and for domed theatrical applications. But very impressive specs on this thing. And look at this recording data rate. 10 gigabytes, not bits, 10 gigabytes recording per second. So he's told me this is kind of a military grade interface that they've got on this thing. Not so cheap, but fascinating. So production status. I mentioned the 2020 Summer Olympics has been postponed. We hope we'll see that next year, pandemic pending. But we also have the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics and Paris in 2024. I'm sure those will be 8K highlighted, perhaps not the whole events, but there will be lots of 8K there, I'm sure. There are trials, as I said before, underway in the sporting events, probably delayed somewhat because of the pandemic. And there are actually a very large number of movies, content that's captured in 8K today. So though REG cameras are used quite extensively today, and if you think, at least I've been told also, that all of the major streaming providers basically require a 4K capture today as a minimum. And then, like I said, many of those are being done with REG cameras that are at 8K. So, the move to requiring the 8K capture is not is believable in the near term. So we're probably going to see, I think, some scanning of film-based work as well in 8K and up conversion of lower resolution content. So mastering of 8K content's not really happening today, but I can see it happening in the next few years for sure. Oops, all right. Okay, so we talked about 8K Live and production workflows. They are here today. We saw a little bit of them on the camera setup for sporting, but most of this is being finished in 2K and 8K today. We're seeing the expansion of the supplier base. IBC, NAB. There continue to be announcements related to this, but there are some pain points, and these pain points are the ones that we've identified from the 8K Association by specifically reaching out to content creators who are actually working with 8K, and we'll probably be publishing a workflow document that will talk about these various workflows. But these are the main pain points that I've heard from these content creators: processing power, memory and storage, transport, and bandwidth. But these are also very similar to the same kinds of issues that were the pain points 6-7 years ago with 4K. So let's talk about these. Real-time 8K grading and editing is possible today. You can do this even on a laptop today. So that's a solvable problem. Yes, you need more horsepower to do this, but this is a solvable problem. Cloud-based workflows are clearly expanding, and all the talk I've heard about workflows and cloud-based stuff is all of this is accelerated because of the pandemic. So we're probably 2 or 3 years further along on the path to cloud-based processing than most people would have thought a year ago. And this is going to be a good option for 8K. These are big files, right? So, the idea of the ability to upload those once into the cloud and work on them either in proxies or even directly on the high resolution files, that capability is available today as well. Again, not particularly cheap, but available. But the trends are, of course, in the right direction. AI is becoming an important part of the whole processing chain at this point. Intel's new XE architecture supports 8K60 and has AV1 decoding in it. The Snapdragon 865 is great for mobile applications. That's what's in some of these phones that have 8K cameras and processing. And NVIDIA just put out this monster graphics card, the RTX 3090, which supports 8K 60 playback over an HDMI 2.1 interface. And the 2.1 interface is an important point here. I think this is the first graphics card that actually supports that. So being able to now have a workstation with 2.1 that can go directly to a 8K TV, very interesting capability. And they just announced they're purchasing ARM. So the whole dynamics in this processing field here are changing, and I think it's going to be a very positive trend for a number of industries, but specifically for 8K as well. Memory and storage. You need more memory, you need more storage. These are big files. But NVMe memory over the PCIe bus has been adopted by all these workflow guys. So I think it's available today. These are available bundled in different kinds of drives. So for example, a 2 terabyte one you can get for as little as $300, or if you want a more sophisticated one, you can pay up to $2,000 for 7.68 terabyte. So again, these solutions are here, and the trends are all going in the right direction. Professional transport. Now we're talking mostly within a production facility. we want to be able to distribute 8K 60p with a 422 and 10-bit, which, if you do the math, is close to 40 gigabits uncompressed. So you're going to need 4 12G cables to do that, SDI cables to do that. Or if you want to use an IP-based SMPTE interface like 2110, you're going to need 4 Ethernet cables for over 4 10G networks, or 1 40G network cable. The good news here is TICO and JPEG XS are now available with lossless compression up to 15:1. And that means now you can do, if you do this, you can use 1 12G SDI cable, or you can now distribute this on a 10 gig Ethernet network, which is quite manageable now. And there have been demonstrations of this. I think it was Fraunhofer just demonstrated this at the virtual IBC as well. And they're doing some pilot work with NHK for this, so this is good. And you know, there are other, for contribution signals, SRT and RIST are also options that are out there. Certainly SRT has been around for a while, and RIST is a new option here for internet delivery. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so let me show you this sample workflow here. This was from an artist named Roman Hill. He's a French filmmaker who's one of the filmmakers we profiled. His workflow, I know you can't read all this, but you can take a look at this later if you want. The point here is, you know, he's using DaVinci Resolve, he's using NVMe storage, he's doing, he has a RED camera capture, and he's doing this in with their RED codec, all on a manageable workstation. He's a small filmmaker. He can do this. If he can do this, you can do this. Okay. Here's another now live broadcast workflow. So if you, again, I'm not going to try and go through this in detail here, but this was from the Roland Garros French Open in 2019, which had, this was a very comprehensive demo that tried to show a whole bunch of different deliverables as with using 8K capture and processing and trying to figure out how to make this all work. So here's a quick summary of some of these deliverables. So well, first of all, you notice that the bit rates are quite high, and that was the reality certainly a year and a half ago, and still probably the reality today. We'll talk a little bit more about how we can start to reduce those over time. But you can see they had a number of TV streaming feeds. Some were over 5G. They had a VR headset feed. They had a direct to home satellite feed, HDR, SDR, HLS, transport stream, dash. So all the various combinations here. So I think this is, you know, it certainly proved it was possible to do. And I think this is going to set the stage for others to follow in their footsteps. And I think these high-profile sporting events are kind of what raises the awareness of the value of 8K to consumers and professionals, frankly. Okay, moving on. We at the 8K Association have also made a concerted effort now to reach out specifically to independent filmmakers and to try and understand why they are leading this revolution, if you will. And what we believe here is that, one, a lot of these filmmakers are unencumbered by a lot of the overhead and other restrictions of bigger studios. They want to push the technology. They want to push the artistic boundaries of what they want to do. And perhaps most importantly, a lot of these filmmakers don't use a lot of special effects. Special effects can be quite costly in 8K if you want to do them in 8K, and most do not do that in 8K right now because of the render time, and render time is money. So that's one of the reasons we want to focus on these independent filmmakers in helping to publicize what they're doing, both from a workflow point of view. We want to also publicize their work, of course. And so we've now created a new kind of class of membership within the 8K Association, a content creator membership option. And it allows them to join the organization, to be active participants in exchange for providing content that our member companies can use. So we hope that you'll see more about what these filmmakers are doing over the coming months and maybe years as we talk with, work with them to create more panels and seminars and workshops and whatnot. So production summary. I think there are clear benefits for 8K capture and or remastering. The entire pipeline for production and mastering, both for live and file-based workflows, is here today. The pain points, there are some pain points: processing power, memory storage, and bandwidth. They're being addressed, and I think I hope I've convinced you that those are all going to be, the trends in those areas are all in the right directions, and those barriers will continue to fall moving forward. So I think, yes, we have arrived at poll number 2. So let me see if I can pull that up. Where'd it go? Where'd my polls go? Oh, here it is down here. Sorry. Okay, you should now have on the screen how strongly do you agree with the statement. 8K workflows are basically similar to 4K workflows, but with added storage, processing, and bandwidth requirements. So that's clearly the message I've heard. I just wanted to see if you agree with that. And let me see if I can do some questions while you're chewing on that. All right, where'd my questions go? Well, Pete's correcting me on my math for bandwidth a little bit here, so I guess we'll talk about that offline. Thank you. And yes, I did mention the Blackmagic 8K camera. Thank you, Florian. Okay, I don't see a lot more questions in the queue right now. Oh, wait a second. Thank you. So Ray is asking about he's talking about the transitions from SD to HD and HD to 4K, 4K to 8K. He says those transitions seem to be getting smaller, and sales and profits on displays and equipment are also getting smaller. Volume revenue also affected by the trend using handheld devices with small displays. Will this affect the 7-year cycle? Well, I don't know. I don't know, Ray. Because of the pandemic, things are certainly, you can start to question that, and plus the trends you noted. So I don't know the answer to that. I think we'll just have to watch that. Sorry. The impact of 8K having on panel design on TVs. Well, I think you've seen all the major panel makers now have 8K panels that they offer to the TV makers. The TV makers have clearly adopted that. And we'll talk about some of the TV trends and technologies a little bit later in the webcast. So if I can get back to you a little bit more on that later, Mark, I appreciate that. All right, let's halt our poll here and see what we've got. Okay, so the question was, are 8K workflows similar to 4K workflows and the pain points from 4 years ago, 6, 7 years ago? 49% of you strongly agree with that statement. 38% somewhat agree, 10% are not sure, and 3% somewhat disagree. No one strongly disagrees with that. Well, that's very good feedback. Thank you very much. All right, let's move on. 8K distribution. So I don't want to go deeply into codecs because that's a whole nother conversation here. But I do want to say that this is actually a pretty unique time in codec development. Historically, we've had really kind of one codec driven by the MPEG Association that's come along with each resolution transition. Now we've got a lot of stuff going on. HEVC, of course, has been tried to lead the charge anyway for 4K. We've got AV1 is now being rolled out by major companies for sure. It's not just Google and YouTube. VVC, the Versatile Video Codec, in development. Essential Video Coding is I think it's close to a final vote. We've got LCEVC also moving towards standardization, and this AVS3, which is really a Chinese-driven kind of counterpart to the MPEG efforts, is also moving forward. So all of these things have certain benefits and advantages, and some of them will be rolled out for 8K, some of them will be more for mobile. There's still a lot of discussion about how these things will roll out and where they will be adopted. But I think because of the issues with HEVC and its fairly low adoption rate because of the unclear licensing and royalty issues, that AV1, there's a clear window for AV1 to gain market share right now. As I said, a lot of companies are adopting that right now. So I think what we'll start to see is these will start to roll out, and 8K may not be the main application for these. In fact, it probably won't be in some cases, but that's okay because the larger market applications can drive the adoption, drive the ecosystem, and 8K can kind of ride on those coattails to some degree. So again, there's lots of trade-offs between all these codecs. I'm not going to try and go into that at this point right now. But the key issue here is we do need to solve 8K distribution. 80 or 100 megabits, which is what NHK is using, is just not going to cut it. So we do have to find solutions. So what I'm thinking, and again, this is based on some of the information I've been hearing from experts in the field here, what might be a good path forward would be to use for 8K anyway, what I'll call for the time being smart streaming, and some of these other codecs, EVC, HEVC, and AV1, and then probably a little bit longer term, you'll see VVC, EVC, and AVS3 start to probably complement what's going on in the market today. So codecs, the use, while all these codecs are good because it's spurring development quickly, it also adds a lot of complexity, and because now you have to potentially transcode for all of these codecs, which is going to be a nightmare if you're on the content and distribution side. So let's talk about smart streaming. Smart streaming, it's at least from the 8K Association perspective, means the following. We want to create a high-quality 8K master, perhaps using professional upconversion from cameras that use lower resolution and or natively 8K. Then we're going to do smart downscaling, down-resing to 4K, capturing the metadata or information that was used in that down resolution step. We're going to now encode this as a 4K stream using probably some conventional codecs, but including that metadata or information. And now when it gets to an 8K TV, they will be able to interpret this metadata and do a smart up-res in the TV. So you get hopefully close to that native 8K image on your TV now. And there are a number of companies that are doing exactly this scenario. Sharp, Samsung, Fujitsu, Harmonic, and others have. I've already shown this, and I'm gonna show you what they've been doing. But there is no good word for this yet. I'm calling it smart streaming, but other people have other words for this and other interpretations of what smart streaming or these other words mean. So content-aware encoding is a real thing. Adaptive encoding is real. AI-assisted encoding is used in this context. Again, there's a lot of, this means different things to different people in the ecosystem. So I think one of the things that we want to try and do here is try and understand what these other approaches mean and what they're doing, and if there's a common way to bring these approaches together in some kind of unified approach. I don't know, but this is something that we want to try to explore. So to dig a little deeper, AIScaleNet is the solution from Samsung, and this does exactly, well, this leverages their upscaler in their TVs. So they have a sophisticated upscaler that does this, so it's kind of the inverse of that if you take the 8K content and smartly downscale it and do that, the encoding then for a 4K distribution. So they're working with Amazon now, and that will, if this goes forward, this will probably start by doing a 4K master for a 2K distribution, because that's where the money is right now. But it does set the stage for 8K later. So this is a proprietary solution. In fact, all these solutions I'm telling you about are proprietary at this point, which is why we want to think about exploring standardization. So they did a demo at CES, yes, when we had a real convention not so long ago. And they encoded, the HEVC encoded of 4K and distributed at 15 megabits and showed the comparison, side-by-side visual comparison to an 8K native HEVC encode at 50 megabits. And they used the Netflix VMAF quality score to evaluate those images. And they said the ScaleNet 4K distribution one got a 95 score, and just for reference, 80 is considered good. So this is encouraging work, I would say. Also at CES, Sharp showed something very similar. They did this over using an IP connection and 5G. And their comparison here now is 85 versus 36 megabits. They didn't have more details or any metrics on the quality here other than to show the video, but clearly they're working on it. Back at IBC 2019, Harmonic put together some content to do what they called content-aware encoding, and they put together some constant bit rate versus comparisons with various forms of 8K and distribution packages. And you can see this chart here. There are different distribution rates. The feedback was that this was good. It's not great yet, but this was also, over about a year ago now. So we'll see how they can move this forward. Fujitsu also talked about a similar kinds of process here, where they're using AI to encode areas differently than conventional codecs. Their claim is that they can reduce file size to 1/10 of the size, and they just compress things differently than a conventional codec might do. So they have not released a lot of information on this yet, and so it's still in kind of early development. But again, another one of these kind of smart encoding approaches here. So let me move on to some of the basic internet delivery issues that we're talking about right now. So if we can find a solution, whether it's smart encoding or it's just plain 8K encoding or 4K encoding, the main vehicles that are going to be moving that forward is still going to be Dash and HLS. But they have been incompatible for a long time. And they can also have long latency issues. So a few years ago, this CMAF was developed, Common Media Application Format, to try and fix this. And it basically consolidates the workflow to allow one media file in an MP4 container that can now be used for both HLS and Dash streaming, and at the same time, reduces the latency to perhaps a second or so, depending on some network configurations. But the whole idea here is you basically you shrink the segment size by adding much smaller chunks in the way you break up the video. Again, there's no point in going into the details here, but this has been being slowly rolled out. I think this is being adopted slower than most people would have wanted, but I think it's starting to gain a little bit of momentum now. And this is not just for 8K, this is for all streaming delivery. So, but it does help 8K, of course. Satellite and OTT delivery. NHK is doing satellite now, too high a data rate. They're also looking at some over-the-air options. They had some demos of that back at IBC 2019, as I recall. But we believe satellite delivery is really on the decline at this point. DirecTV here in the US is not going to launch any new satellites. They're quickly moving, their subscribers over to broadband delivery. And an 8K bandwidth with current codecs takes up a full transponder today, so it's just not economically viable. And as far as I know, ATSC 3.0 and DPV, the S2X standards, have no 8K definition as part of that, and they have limited bandwidth as well. So I think the bottom line here is IP transport is going to be really the best alternative for 8K. We'll talk briefly about 5G as well. So we need some, there's a bunch of new bands that go with 5G now, and they add a lot of things in terms of efficiency and provide more bandwidth, and it's more robust. A lot of these benefits are on the carrier side. Some of those are on the end user side. But you have to be very careful when you talk about 5G because the performance is very different between these bands. Obviously, the lower bands have the longest distance and the lowest data rates, and they're not line of sight, and they will penetrate trees. But as you go up in wavelength, you lose all those things. You lose the line of sight and the penetration and the distance, but you get data rates. So there's a bunch of variations that people talk about here, which can be very confusing. And again, I don't want to go into details. This is just for background purposes here. But I think the realities of 5G is millimeter wave is where all the hype is here. That's where they talk about, you know, all the advantages and the speed and blah, blah, blah. The reality is, since it's line of sight, you're not going to see transmitters on every fifth telephone pole. This is going to be for backhaul. It's going to be for private campuses, commercial applications, maybe in dense urban environments. But the reality is, for most consumers, that's going to be a sub 6G, 5G delivery for their homes. You know, it'll be viable, but it's also going to have to be highly compressed to fit in there. So I think just be very careful when people talk about 8K and 5G to separate the millimeter wave from the reality. I think is my only message here. Again, from what I hear from folks. Cable, I think, and broadband delivery is going to be probably the best option here for internet, obviously for internet delivery as well. The cable industry, certainly in the U.S. anyway, is going through a major upgrade right now from 1 gigabit networks to 10 gigabit fiber networks. So this is rolling out with almost all the cable providers that I'm aware of. So this will be a major upgrade, and it'll be a very complex topology, but it can be supported potentially with the new Wi-Fi 6. So, you know, being able to deliver a high bandwidth to your home, and then having Wi-Fi 6 distribution within your home, I think will deliver very reasonable data rates for 8K. Probably more data than you're going to need if some of these other smart streaming and other advanced codecs come into fruition in the next few years. So here's just a nice graphic of this topology, just for reference. So 8K streaming prospects. Again, we believe 8K that streaming will be the major weapon to deliver 8K to the homes, just as 4K was. We're starting to see some smart encoding development now, as I pointed out. We do need a critical mass of 8K TVs and decoders, and we need more 8K native content before the major OTT providers jump in with an 8K service. So there is some 8K content. We do need more, of course, but we're also starting to see some of these smaller, and actually some of these are not so small. So if you see on the right there, Chile, Migogo, and the Explorers have also just had an announcement with Samsung that they will support now not only 8K, but 8K with HDR10 plus Samsung's and others supported dynamic metadata HDR format. So this is all good news. Plus, actually, the Explorers is one of the ones that actually has a streaming service right now with 2 Samsung TVs. I guess Samsung developed an app specifically to be able to stream 8K Explorers content to their 8K TV. So it's starting. So in summary, and now I'll get to the questions in just a second here. We need to reduce the data rate. 80 megabits is not going to happen. Many believe we need to get into the range that we're doing now for quality streaming, 15 to 25 megabits or so. So we've got new codecs that are coming along. We've got some smart streaming options that could be developed. I don't think satellite and over-the-air will be viable in the long term, if ever. 5G can work, just realize it's not millimeter wave. Cable networks are best positioned to deliver streaming services. And my prediction, limited streaming services are starting now into next year, but I think it's going to be 2 to 3 years before the bigger players pull the trigger on that. So poll number 3. Let me see if I can pull that up. I apologize, I'm running a little long here, so I will Try and speed it up a little. Okay, how do you agree with this statement? Developing a cost-effective streaming solution is the key to opening up 8K streaming services. And let me turn to some of the questions here. Will set-top boxes with decompression continue to exist, or will decompression move inside the TV, thus reduce bandwidth speeds to the TV? Yeah, I think set-top boxes will continue. You know, we're seeing there are advanced chipsets already that support AV1, HEVC, and 8K. We just haven't seen those rolled out in set-top boxes yet, but the chipsets are there for sure. Please elaborate on the creator membership option. How does the trade-off work exchanging content for membership? The creators will still have their own content rights. Yes, so we ask that they contribute 15 minutes of content that our members can use in both private and public demos, as well as to be able to post on YouTube. They still maintain the rights to that content. They are giving us basically a license to use it. In exchange for an associate level membership, which allows them to join our working groups and to participate actively in what we're doing. Okay, I hope that answers that, Paul. Thank you. Can we get a PDF of the slide deck? Yes, absolutely. The slide deck, the video, and the full report will be available after the webinar. Thanks, Alan, for that. I think I've answered most of the questions so far. Okay, it looks like most of you have finished responding to the poll, so let's see what we got here. Developing cost-effective streaming solution is the key to opening up 8K streaming services. 69% of you strongly agree with that, 21% somewhat agree, 6% not sure, 3% somewhat disagree, 1% strongly disagree. So that seems to be a pretty good endorsement of that concept. Thank you. Okay, 8K playback. So as far as I know, there will not be an 8K Blu-ray disc format that will be commercialized. There is a record format that was commercialized for Japan only market, but again, as far as I know, no players will be developed at this point. We talked about the NVMe flash memory that can be used for playback. So I think that seems kind of reasonable. A USB stick with that kind of support to playback content could be very viable. I just answered the set-top box question. There's nothing right now other than there is one in Japan for NHK. But I think that that's inevitable that will come. We've now seen the first AVRs that are out there. These do pass through and they do upscaling. They're not really playback devices, but they can create 8K content from low resolution and then allow that to be streamed over 2.1 to the TV. So this is kind of interesting to see. You know, who's gonna do the best upscaling, the AVR or the TV? Good question. The two new console games, PS5, Xbox Series 10, will support 8K. We're starting to see more news roll out about that. So that will be at the end of this year. Here's some uncompressed data rates. So Pete, you're going to double check me on this, I'm sure. So I'm not even going to linger on this. And here are the wired options that I'm aware of right now. HDMI 2.0, 2.1. We've got several DisplayPort versions, Thunderbolt, and USB 3 and 4 using the alt modes. You can power a display. So as you can see, some of these also have DSC, display stream compression, which is a lossless up to 3:1 compression option. So many of these will allow, well, HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.2a will allow 8K 20 and 24 and 30 frames, so that can work fairly well for some content. Most people are going to want to have 8K 60 content, however, so you're going to want to have these higher bandwidth options for sure. So HDMI 2.1 is in the 8K TVs today. It's not in a lot of other equipment yet. There are cables that will support that, but we're going to need more devices for that. And of course, we still have a pretty good separation between the IT world and DisplayPort and Thunderbolt and the TV world with HDMI. So USB may be the bridge that helps to bring those together. We'll see. Wi-Fi, I mentioned the Wi-Fi 6 routers and devices are rolling out now. They use the same gigahertz bands, but they can increase speed. They do enable bonding and they reduce latency. And there's some new news that the 6 gigahertz band has been approved by the FCC, I do believe, and that should allow more speed and capacity. So this should be fine for 8K streaming. I'm going to skip the questions and move along to display. All the major 8K TVs today have some version of AI-based upscaling, and this is important because it's quite different from the kind of the upscaling that we've had in the past. And I actually would I'd rather refer to this as image restoration more at this point right now. So historically, we've had a number of algorithms that are really relying on looking at the pixels near you and scaling the content based on the quality of those pixels. Let's call it, in general, a nearest neighbor approach. So this new kind of upscaling or image restoration is based on both machine learning and neural network algorithms, and they're offered by, like I say, all the top tier players at this point. It's good. My assessment of these, again, my personal assessment, is the algorithms are very good if you have 4K content that you're upscaling to 8K. It's good for 2K, and it's okay for lower resolution content. There's still much more work that needs to be done. But remember, those are a lot of pixels that you're trying to create going from this lower resolution content. So, but the good news here is that most of these algorithms are updatable. So these manufacturers continue to work on to continue to do the machine learning. They continue to work their neural networks, and so they can upgrade, firmware upgrade these the algorithms in the TVs, theoretically, to keep these algorithms improving over time. That's something you certainly couldn't do with previous upscaling technologies. So I think not all these algorithms are the same for sure, and you will see differences in image quality based on different types of content from these different manufacturers. So this is something you clearly want to look at, when you're looking at a TV, is how they do this upscaling based on the content that you look at, for example. Okay, devices. TVs are the main product that's out there today. There is a monitor from Dell. I've seen Sharp and others demonstrate monitors. Maybe they'll enter this year, maybe next year. 8K VR headsets are likely at some point, maybe next year. Digital signage out there, basically professional versions of the TV panels are out there today. I would not be surprised to see 8K in laptops next year or the year after. 8K phones, probably not. Very quickly on the TV technology, LCD 8K TVs are actually available today, 55-inch to 120-inch. Sharp has a 120-inch behemoth that they offer. And the big trend here is increasing fidelity by increasing the number of zones on the image. So in a dual cell approach, it's literally 2 LCDs back to back with a monochrome back cell. That allows you to have millions of zones. The other clear development trend here in displays is going to mini LEDs, which is, in other words, lots more and much smaller LEDs in the backlight. So that gets you to thousands of zones. The traditional full array local dimming backlights will give you hundreds of zones, and edge backlights are in the dozens of zones. And all these trends toward thousands and millions of zones is to get to the image quality of an OLED. And of course, OLEDs 8Ks are now available in 77 and 88 inch. But the advantage of doing like the mini LEDs, for example, on the LCDs, is you can now get close to the OLED image quality performance, but with much brighter, higher luminance levels, allowing a bigger color volume. So we've seen micro LED. Now I'm talking about micro LEDs are direct emissive displays, not in backlights. So you shrink the LEDs even further. And you can create, basically these are video walls with variable pitches from 0.6 to 1.1 have been demonstrated by a number of companies. Much bigger displays, of course, now. These are hundreds of inches for 8K displays. But as these micro LEDs get smaller and the pixel pitches get smaller, you'll start to see more standard TV sizes. And Samsung has talked about launching things that are in the 75 to 100 and something 20 inch or so in a more standard TV size. And there's other developments coming along in the TV space. QD on OLEDs by Samsung Display, and electroluminescent OLEDs as well. So we'll see how that technology develops. But I think the key takeaway here is there's lots of innovation going on in the display space here that will continue to drive this market forward, both in performance and resolution. And 8K is just part of the mix here. So 8K TV is available from all the major brands. Distribution will vary by geography. Prices are high, but they're coming down. And this certainly happened for 4K, we know, and I think it's going to happen again for 8K. And the big driver here is all these 10.5G fabs. Has been for the last couple of years a huge build out in China of these latest generation fabs, and these fabs are specifically optimized for 65 and 75 inch panels. And so that capacity is there. That they will be making these displays. It will drive the prices down because there'll be lots of volume, and that will drive the prices down. And we're already seeing that. There's been some fluctuations because of COVID, but the long-term trend is clearly in the right direction here. And that's on the LCD side. The mini LEDs will help that to drive the performance up, and then longer term, I think micro LEDs, direct view micro LEDs, and dual cell, all these will continue to invigorate this market. So I am going to stop there. I've talked quite a bit. I'll answer any last minute questions, and I apologize for running quite late here. Let me take a quick peek. Do I know of anybody planning implementing BNOVA's MPEG-5? That's the LCEPC. I know people are looking at that. I do not know of any firm plans at this point. 8K projection. Yes, there are 8K projectors out there. They are not, I guess there are a couple of native 8K imagers out there. Most of the ones that are out there are image shifting projectors, so they use an optic or an optical element to create multiple fields to create an 8K image on the screen. Those are available. They are varying price, but they're again at the high end. I think you'll probably see those more in larger venues. It's not something that we're looking at in the 8K Association, although I have had people from that market segment ask me about that. We're open to looking at certifying 8K projectors and making it part of our ecosystem. That's fine. Right now, we support it in theory, but we could support it more actively if there was a number of projector makers that were willing to come together and work with us on something. So, do we use VMAP to do the AIScaleNet? Yes, it was. Yes, exactly. It was VMAP. They got the score of 95. So it's not suitable for this content. Okay, I'm not sure about that. Maybe we can talk about that offline, Bruno. Content is said to be king. How can major content providers be enticed to invest? So I think we need to solve, well, actually the 3 polls I mentioned, I conducted, I think were part of that. Finding an 8K distribution solution that's cost effective is going to be critical. I think also making sure that the value proposition of capturing in 8K and actually pushing to finish in 8K, we need to educate and try and make a lot of decision makers understand that's a key value proposition. So we can prime the 8K content pump, if you will. I think on the TV side, that will come. The price points will come down, and that market will happen. So I think it's solving the distribution problem and making sure that the content creators and the decision makers in the content production pipeline understand the value of 8K and push toward making more content available. So I hope that answers your question, Chris. And I'm going to stop there. I appreciate all the time that you all spent with me here. As I said before, you will all be getting an email with the video for this presentation, the slide deck, and the full 8K report if you want to download those later. So thank you very much. Have a good day or a good evening.